Let's first look at a typical cell and some of the different organelles and what they do. Then we're going to look at how we can produce energy out of either carbohydrates or fats. And then what happens when some of our organelles don't do what they're supposed to. And then what can we do about it? Here is a stereotypical picture of a cell. When we look inside of a cell, we have the nucleus. This is where we store all of our DNA. And this is where our genes are transcribed and made into messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA leaves the nucleus through these nuclear pores. And then it will go to one of these ribosomes on this structure called the endoplasmic reticulum. We have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which is where we make proteins. And then we have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that has a bunch of other functions, including producing carbohydrates and some types of fats. Sometimes after a protein is produced on these little ribosomes, it will get processed and packaged and maybe modified in this structure called the Golgi complex or the Golgi apparatus. And then sometimes those proteins are either used inside of the cell or they can be released outside of the cell. If they leave the cell, they sometimes leave through these little membrane structures called vesicles, and then it can be released out of the cell. Okay, three organelles I want to highlight. One is peroxisomes. These are membrane-bound structures that play a role in producing the phospholipids that actually make up the cell membrane and the membranes inside the cell that are making up the organelles. So that's what the peroxisomes do, one of the functions. Another organelle is called the lysosome, and this contains digestive enzymes that helps the cell to break down macromolecules or old cell parts. Okay, and that'll be more important in a minute. And then we have our mitochondria, and these are the organelles that are producing our energy in the form of ATP. Okay, a quick look at membranes. So membranes are composed of these phospholipid molecules. Each phospholipid molecule has a head component that is called polar, so it means that it is basically water soluble, so it will interact with the water molecules outside of the cell or inside of the cell. And there's the polar part is either inside the cell or outside of the cell, and then in between here, these little tails, these are fatty acids. So a phospholipid is composed of this phosphate. Usually it contains another molecule, either choline or ethanolamine. Then it has the fatty acid chains that make up the tails, and that is the oily sort of middle part of the membrane. And that fat layer acts like a barrier so that only certain things can get in or out of the cell. And lots of things will use a membrane protein, like these big green blobs here, that help to transport things in and out of the cell. If our cell membrane is not healthy, then we won't have the appropriate membrane proteins and cell receptors and things that will bind to hormones to trigger signaling or to appropriately bring in nutrients into the cell. So we need to have a healthy cell membrane for cells to be functioning properly. And this includes the membranes inside of the cell that make up the organelles. Also inside of the cell, we have cholesterol molecules. These are very important for helping the cell membrane to have a good structure. And then this is also where we need our omega-3, 6, and 9 essential fatty acids. Usually we are not deficient in omega-6. We usually need to increase our omega-3, which is anti-inflammatory, and it helps to decrease inflammation. This is what our energy molecule looks like. So this is an ATP. So it is an adenosine, which is actually just like a nucleotide. So the nucleotides are the molecules that make up our DNA and RNA. So adenine is one of those, except that now it has 3 phosphates. And when we break off this last phosphate and it binds to something else like a protein, then it causes that protein to move, and that's how it transfers energy. So when we look at our mitochondria, what they are producing that is so important is these ATP energy molecules. Now, let's just have a quick look at some nutrients. What do we use to make that energy? So we can use carbohydrates and we can use fats. So when we think about our starchy foods, like potatoes and rice and bread and pasta and those kinds of things, all starches, when they are digested, they're broken down into glucose molecules. So these glucose molecules can be used to make energy simply because they have carbon and hydrogen bonds. And what we do is we move the hydrogens and electrons from the sugar. So the sugar gets oxidized, the NAD gets reduced, and then we build up these NADH molecules. That is very important for being able to make energy. We can also use fats to produce energy because fats also have carbon and hydrogen bonds. I just want to point out quickly that saturated fats have all single bonds between the carbons, and unsaturated fats have a double bond, one or more double bonds. So if this was olive oil, it would have one double bond, and then we call it a monounsaturated. Fats that have more than one double bond is a polyunsaturated. Generally, the seed oils are polyunsaturates, and they tend to be more inflammatory and not as healthy. And then the other kind of fat that we want to watch out for is trans fats. Trans fats have this structure, so when we have the double bond, the hydrogens are on opposite sides of the double bond. Okay, so we want to avoid those, and we want to eat these. So we can use sugars and fats to make energy. When the fats are broken down, we can produce ketones, or we can just break those fatty acid chains into carbon chunks that can join the whole process of making energy. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So just quickly about glucose metabolism and fat metabolism. So when we're looking at glucose metabolism, we often think about insulin. Insulin is the hormone that will bind to a receptor. So our insulin hormone is produced by our pancreas. The beta islet pancreas cells will produce insulin when our blood sugar goes up. Blood sugar is really, really important for when I talk about fasting and that information. So when our blood sugar goes up, we produce insulin. Insulin binds to a receptor on the membrane. This receptor, when the insulin binds, it triggers the production of glucose transporters. When the glucose transporters are present on the membrane, then the glucose can bind and it will move into the cell. Without the glucose transporters, glucose will stay outside of the cell in the bloodstream. So when we think about insulin resistance, what's happening is when we have too much blood sugar for a long period of time, and then we produce too much insulin for a long period of time, then what happens is, let's suppose this is a liver cell here, the liver cell will eventually stop putting as many insulin receptors and glucose transporters in the membrane. This is insulin resistance. When the insulin receptors are decreased, then the blood sugar is going to stay in the bloodstream. If the insulin is not binding to these receptors, then we are not triggering the production of the glucose transporters. And then the sugar stays outside of the cell. This is insulin resistance, and this is what can lead to type 2 diabetes. This is important as well when I talk about the fasting because it impacts insulin receptors and it impacts insulin resistance. Now, just a quick look at fat metabolism. When we look at breaking down fat, so our fat is generally stored in our adipose tissue, which is the fat underneath our skin. When we store fat, because we're animals, we store that fat as saturated fat. So it has single bonds between all of the carbons. When we break down that fat, we will produce fatty acids, And some of those fatty acids will get used to make ATP, and some of those fatty acids will be converted into ketones. And then the ketones can be used to make ATP. Also, our fatty acids can be converted in the liver into glucose. And then the liver can break down the fats or convert those fats into glucose to keep the blood sugar stable. Also, when we store excess carbs, a little bit, we don't, most of our extra energy is stored as fat, but we do store some carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. And this is just basically kind of like a starch, but just slightly different bonding structure, is chains of sugars or branched sugar molecules that can be stored in the liver or the muscles. So when our blood sugar decreases, our liver can take glycogen and produce glucose to increase our blood sugar. The liver can take fatty acids or even ketones, and we can produce glucose to keep our blood sugar stable. We can use glucose or fats or ketones to produce energy. So we have lots of ways of breaking down molecules and converting molecules so that we always have an available supply of a molecule that we can use to make energy. Okay, so when we look at the hormones that are involved in fat metabolism, we have many different hormones that stimulate these fat cells to release fatty acids so that we can either use it directly for energy or we can make blood sugar. So my point with all of this is that if you went a period of time without eating, you have lots of ways of making sure that your body can increase your blood sugar. So here's a picture of some ketones. We have 3 main ketones that we produce from fatty acids from breaking down fat molecules. So we have acetone, we have acetoacetate, and then we have beta hydroxybutyrate. These are the 3 main ketones that are produced. And when we use ketones to produce energy, they enter what's called the Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria is where we make all of our energy. So these ketones can be used by the mitochondria, and it can be converted into this molecule called acetyl-CoA. Once we have acetyl coenzyme A, then that joins a whole bunch of chemical reactions where, again, we're going to produce NADH molecules. So we want to collect all these NADHs because we actually want the hydrogens. We want those protons. So a hydrogen ion is also called a proton. Now, when we get inside of our mitochondria have 2 membranes. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. ATP is produced because of changing the concentration, basically, of protons in the mitochondria. So when we have glucose available, we will break down the glucose. We make this molecule called pyruvate, which then goes inside of the mitochondria. Then here's our acetyl-CoA molecule. If we didn't have very much glucose, let's suppose our blood sugar's been dropping because we didn't eat for a little while, but we decided to go for a walk, and now we need to have a little bit of ATP. Our fatty acid molecules, or ketones, can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Then we go through our Krebs cycle, and we produce all these NADH and FADH2 molecules. These come from our B vitamins. This is why when you have a lot of stress or you have very low energy, something to think about is your B vitamin intake, which is mostly in animal foods, but you can get it from various sources. When we come up with all of these proton molecules, then we're going to go to this last stage here inside the mitochondria on the inner membrane where we have the electron transport chain. And there's a bunch of different molecules in this electron transport chain where we're going to move electrons and we are going to pump these hydrogen ions. All of these hydrogens that we have collected are going to move into that space in between the two membranes. That produces a gradient. Then those protons are going to move through a very specific membrane protein called an ATP synthase, which is actually not in this diagram. Let's draw an ATP synthase. And then these hydrogens that have been pumped across the membrane in this intermembrane space here, they will then only be able to move through this special membrane protein, and then we make all kinds of ATP. So I wanted to just briefly mention the electron transport chain because of these protons. Proton pump inhibitors that are used to treat acid reflux or heartburn will affect the proton pumps in the mitochondria that are involved in making energy. So there's various ways to deal with heartburn. So just consider that taking a proton pump inhibitor for a long period of time is going to impact your energy production. The other thing I want to mention is statins. Statin drugs will deplete this coenzyme Q molecule, or ubiquinone, which is part of the electron transport chain. So statins are used to lower blood cholesterol levels, which is not the same as a cholesterol molecule. Blood cholesterol is usually measuring low density lipoproteins, which contain cholesterol, but also all kinds of other things. When LDLs are high, it is correlated with an increased risk in heart disease. So sometimes when people have high LDLs, doctors will prescribe statins. So keep in mind that statins will deplete coenzyme Q, and then you would want to take a supplement of ubiquinol or ubiquinone or a coenzyme Q supplement so that you still can make this molecule. I also want to point out that when you take something as a supplement, it doesn't mean that your body is going to use it the way that it's supposed to. So just taking ubiquinone or ubiquinol as a supplement doesn't necessarily mean that all of it is going to go to the mitochondria and then your electron transport chain is going to work perfectly, right? So, but taking that supplement is absolutely better than nothing, and it does help prevent that. Ideally, hopefully, you just don't need to take statins if, you keep your LDLs under control, which we can do with fasting and exercise. Here, I wanted to point out all the different kinds of nutrients that we use when we're making energy. So remember, thousands of mitochondria in every cell in the whole body, including your brain, your muscles, your heart, your liver. Every single system requires ATP for all chemical reactions. So building proteins, making hormones, making signaling molecules, having cellular communication, regenerating cells, all of that requires energy. So when we think about energy, don't just think about your muscles and exercise. Everything needs ATP. So we need to have our B vitamins because these are the vitamins that are helping us to produce the NADHs and the FADH2s and our acetyl-CoA, so that we have all of these protons to be able to use that gradient to make energy. So we need B vitamins. We need healthy membranes. We need omega-3. You can get that from fish oil, krill oil, cod liver oil. Omega-3 is an important anti-inflammatory molecule that we use in all of our cell membranes. So then with the omega-3, then we can convert that into other forms. So we use ALA, we use DHA and EPA. So we want to make sure that we have omega-3. Our cells can't make that. That's why it's called an essential fatty acid, because we have to consume it. We also need vitamin C, and our vitamin E molecules act like antioxidants. I also wanted to point out that when we're producing ATP and these hydrogens are coming back across the membrane, it combines with oxygen. We breathe oxygen to make energy. And so those hydrogens, when they come back across, they combine with oxygen and we produce water. But sometimes we can also produce peroxide, H2O2. This is that substance that you may have put on a cut before where it bubbles. We need to have the right amount of peroxide. We use peroxide for killing things, killing pathogens. White blood cells make lots of it. And it's used as a signaling molecule. But too much of it becomes a reactive oxygen species, which an ROS. And so we don't want to have too much reactive molecules because that will increase inflammation. So we always need to have a balance of everything, right? So just like we need to balance our blood sugar, balance our insulin molecules, we need to have the right amount of peroxide, and then we also need to have antioxidants to help decrease any reactive oxygen species. We also need to have minerals, zinc and magnesium and copper, very important for producing ATP. Iron and copper are components of the electron transport chain. I talked about coenzyme Q. And then also carnitine is a form of an amino acid that helps the mitochondria to be able to use fats. When we are looking at, now think about the cell and all of the different components that have different functions. When we look at the mitochondria, its main role is to make energy, but mitochondria also do all kinds of other things.